So we'll get started. I'm Adele Perry. I teach here in the departments of History and Women's and Gender Studies. I direct the Center for Human Rights Research, and I also work with the Just Waters Project. And this is an event that is brought to you by the Just Waters Project. The project is subtitled Thinking with Hydro-Social Relations for a More Just and Sustainable World. It's a project that is funded by the University of Manitoba's IGNITE program and supported by the Center for Human Rights Research. And our goal is to shred critical insights on the connections between water and justice and broader struggles for a more just and sustainable world amidst climate crisis. We have a holistic and interdisciplinary approach, and central to all of this is understanding water as a living entity and a relation. I am a settler. This project and the work that we do are based here in the lands of the Anishinaabe, Innuwak, Enes and Innuwak, and Dakota Ayate, and the national homeland of the Red River Métis, and bound by the relationships of both Treaty 1 and also the Manitoba Act. This is located in the Lake Winnipeg watershed, and we here benefit and live amongst the many waters that flow into this, including the Red, Winnipeg, Saskatchewan, Poplar, Barrens, Pigeon, Manitowoc, Dauphin, Fisher, and Icelandic rivers. And Lake Winnipeg is currently being nutrient loaded from agricultural runoff, livestock production, and sewage, including from us at the City of Winnipeg. Our drinking water comes from Shoal Lake and Treaty 3, our hydroelectricity from the north and the west, mainly Treaty 5, and both our water and our power has come at the direct expense of Indigenous peoples in those lands and with those waters. Today, we are very lucky to be joined by Dr. Shannon Stunden Bower, who's an environmental historian of Northern North America, with particular attention to what we would now know as Canada and Western Canada. And Shannon will be speaking about Refusing to Harness a River, a study of dryland farmers resisting irrigation in mid-20th century Saskatchewan. Shannon's research focuses on the prairies in the Northern Great Plains and addresses questions related to water management and government institutions. Shannon is the author of a magisterial study of drainage, and it is only in the context of Manitoba that one might talk about a magisterial study of drainage, but this is the place to talk about it, called Wet Prairie, and more recently the author of Transforming the Prairies, Agricultural Rehabilitation in Modern Canada, published in 2025 by UBC Press. And I will say, as a sometimes historian of water, I think Shannon's research provides a real model of how we can think about water in historical terms and understand how it has been and continues to be crucial to the lived experience of power and colonialism in these tender lands. We're grateful at Just Waters for our friends and relatives at the University of Winnipeg's Riley Chair in Canadian History, and also the Institute for Humanities Food Histories Cluster for their collaboration in bringing Shannon back home to the banks of the Red River with all of its history. So I will welcome Shannon up. I will also let everybody know, if you haven't already figured this out, there's food and you're welcome to just go and get it as you would like to. And Shannon will be speaking for a little more than half an hour, and then we can have some conversation. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be here today. I'm grateful to many people for making this visit possible, particularly here at the University of Alberta, Adele, Sarah, Angela, Jocelyn. Grateful to the people at the University of Winnipeg who brought me out here. As Adele suggested, this is home to me in many ways, and it's a pleasure to be back. So I'm going to talk today about farmer efforts to resist the imposition of irrigation in mid-20th century Saskatchewan. Irrigation loomed in Saskatchewan in this period as part of a large-scale, multi-purpose resource management project known as the South Saskatchewan Regional Plan. This was a project that involved the construction of 2 dams, a very large one that became known as Gardner Dam, and a somewhat smaller one known as the Compel River Dam. The project also involved the creation of an enormous reservoir that stretched between these 2 pieces of infrastructure and also back up the main stem of the South Saskatchewan River. If you look at these images here, you can sort of orient yourself in relation to this infrastructure. The composite aerial image, the greenish one here, you find Gardner Dam at the upper end of the sort of the cross section of the tilted T, the Compel River Dam at the lower end of that tilted T crossbar, and then Lake Diefenbaker extending up the main stem of the Saskatchewan River. This image here, get too far from the microphone. This image here is a photograph, an aerial photograph of Gardner Dam pretty soon in the process of construction in 1959. So you can see both sort of the beginning of work there and also what the landscape looked like prior to the start of construction. So the South Saskatchewan Regional Plan was justified primarily in the hydroelectricity it was anticipated to generate, and also in terms of the irrigation it was anticipated to make possible. It was a joint undertaking funded by federal and provincial governments. And under the joint project agreement that was signed in July 1958, Ottawa agreed to pay the majority of construction costs, though Regina was still on the hook for a fairly substantial contribution. This governing agreement also obliged Regina to undertake the construction of water distribution infrastructure to serve 50,000 acres of potentially irrigable land. And it was ultimately this irrigation commitment in the governing agreement for the project that set up the confrontation between Dryland farmers and the Saskatchewan government that I'm going to be talking about today. So the Drylander resistance that I'll be talking about today was geographically centered in an area along the South Saskatchewan River about 100 kilometers south of the city of Saskatoon. This was called the Outlook-Broderick area after two rural communities situated in this landscape. These two maps here are both documenting the lands that were anticipated to be made irrigable by the South Saskatchewan Regional Plan, though obviously at different scales. This one here with the one right behind me with the red square, I've used the red square to indicate the Outlook-Broderick area. So that's the sort of the center of the resistance I'll be talking about today. And to connect these maps with the images, the aerial images on the previous slide, here is Gardner Dam. So we're looking at an area north of Gardner Dam and to the east of the South Saskatchewan River. So in focusing on resistance, I'm talking about something that is often of interest to historians. Resistance is a form of agency that is often particularly visible in the documentary record. Additionally, in how it is often particularly memorable to involved historical actors, resistance can also serve to anchor oral histories and interviews with informants. And focusing on resistance invites historians to help generate more nuanced and more accurate renderings of the past. So this is a really sort of important focus of historical inquiry. Within historians' broad focus on resistance, in recent years, a substantial number of scholars have documented efforts by affected communities to push back in the face of high modern, state-sponsored projects like the South Saskatchewan Regional Plan, the large-scale water management infrastructure that included this irrigation dimension. In a Canadian context, this scholarship focused on resistance to high modernist transformative projects, has focused on resistance from urban neighborhoods and from rural areas, from Indigenous communities and from racialized groups. And it's focused on areas ranging geographically from north to the Maritimes to BC. So this is a really big and important literature. I hope the rural resistance born of a Saskatchewan dryland farming community that I'm focused on here might help to contribute to expanding our understanding of these broader patterns of state action and popular dissent. At this point, before we get any deeper into the history of resistance in the Outlook-Broderick area, I'd like to take a moment to recognize that neither governments nor resistors seem to recognize that Indigenous peoples might have particular concerns about the South Saskatchewan Regional Plan and the transformative infrastructure that it involved, or that the project might bear on treaty relations in any significant manner. As Denis Solinet and Métis writer Matthew James Vagel has recently noted in verse, by altering the shoreline of the South Saskatchewan River, this project altered the boundaries of Treaty 6, which had been made between the Crown and various Indigenous nations in 1876. This ignorance of, or perhaps lack of care toward, the treaty context around the South Saskatchewan Regional Plan, shared as it was by both irrigation proponents and dissenters, might be part of what historian Dan Meister calls the affordance of whiteness in the mid-20th century agricultural prairies. So it was shortly after Saskatchewan and Canada signed the governing agreement for the South Saskatchewan Regional Plan that we first encounter evidence of substantial expressions of concern from local farmers who expected to be affected. By fall 1958, some worried farmers in the proposed irrigation area formed what they called the Irrigation Investigation Group. Members of this group worried about what they called irrigation's darker side, which they felt that this darker side might well outweigh any benefits ensuing from irrigation. Early on, evidence suggests that there were about 100 farmers involved in this irrigation investigation group, and the vast majority of these were from the Outlook-Broderick area. So let's think a bit more about what lay behind farmer concerns around irrigation in this early period. Evidence makes clear that Drylanders were worried about irrigation as a form of farming. Given that successful management of irrigation water required intensive day-to-day labor throughout much of the growing season, the demands of irrigation farming differed quite substantially from the established rhythms of dryland farming, which was defined by labor peaks at key moments in the seasonal round. The change itself, the potential shift between dryland and irrigated farming, was worrying, given the challenges of adaptation, and there's evidence that some may have felt that irrigation farming was a less desirable way of making a living, even if you discount the difficulties of transition. But the evidence makes pretty clear that the issue for most farmers concerned about irrigation was not reluctance to take on work or new forms of work, but skepticism about prospects for irrigation-driven prosperity. Farmers felt government optimism about irrigation was radically overblown and took a skeptical view of prospects for lucrative irrigated crops like sugar beet. Farmers worried about the costs of developing irrigation, things like land leveling, the construction of on-farm distribution systems, and they also worried about environmental risks like salinization. Drylanders also objected to irrigation on the grounds of fairness. Dissenters recognized that the province-wide irrigation-driven prosperity trumpeted by government would benefit many groups other than farmers, like the construction industry, businesses of various sorts, and rural municipalities who would be adding to their tax base. These groups wouldn't have to make the same investments or take on the same risks as farmers, and they wouldn't have to adapt to a new style of farming. And so there seemed to farmers who were objecting to irrigation to be an inequitable distribution of risks and benefits in the offing. Drylander objections to irrigation that were put forward by the Irrigation Investigation Group were also informed by the character of the Outlook-Broderick community. Area farm operators in Outlook-Broderick were older than the provincial average, and irrigation itself had a pretty substantial learning curve. In this context, the shorter runway to anticipated retirement for many Outlook-Broderick farm operators dampened local views of irrigation. And if demographics were a factor, so was ethnicity. The Outlook-Broderick community was largely Scandinavian, and this contributed to community cohesion and heightened fears about changes in agricultural practice that might disrupt valued aspects of the local community. And finally, farmers from Outlook-Broderick rejected the government view of agriculture in their area as somehow deficient or disappointing. Many farmers in this area expressed satisfaction with the returns that were already available from established dryland farms, and were confident in their assessments of future prospects, continued in that dryland vein. So as irrigation dissenters gave voice to these various concerns in Saskatchewan, Saskatchewan's Cooperative Commonwealth Federation government recognized that these concerns would have to be taken seriously. And so the government ultimately committed to consultation with those farmers who were in areas targeted for irrigation. A 1959 documentary film that was produced under the auspices of the National Film Board included a dramatization of one of the sorts of consultation episodes that was undertaken by the CCF in cooperation with the National Farmers Union, focused on farmers who wanted to share their views of irrigation. And the images you have on the slide before you now are stills from this dramatization of the consultation processes that were undertaken. Ultimately, when the CCF announced its irrigation policy in April 1963, this policy amounted to a pretty substantial compromise on the aggressive approach to irrigation that the government had initially advanced. So it would seem that dissenters had some early success in prompting government to revisit its original approach. But what looked like an early success for dissenters was nullified when the Liberals defeated the CCF in a 1964 provincial election in Saskatchewan. Soon after they came to power, the Liberals announced that they would move ahead with a really aggressive approach to irrigation development. The matter ultimately came to a head in 1966 when the Liberals sought to pass the Saskatchewan River Irrigation Act. This was a piece of legislation that would empower the provincial government to declare that irrigation would be developed in the Outlook-Broderick area. Under the terms of this legislation, no favorable vote from the affected residents in the targeted area would be required. This lack of a provision for a vote was a departure from standard practice in irrigation development and from prevailing province-wide irrigation legislation already on the books in Saskatchewan. And this 1966 legislation also proposed to enable the government to impose on area farmers charges related to operations and maintenance of irrigation infrastructure. So this was a tax. It became commonly known as the water tax. This was sort of the term used to relate to this imposition on farmers in the area. And this water tax was the major mechanism through which farmers could be compelled to irrigate. Farmers would be obliged to pay the water tax by this legislation, regardless of whether they irrigated or not. And only the higher returns that were anticipated to ensue from irrigation farming would give the farmers any ability to do so without financial disaster. And so under these terms, irrigation would, as farmers saw it, become compulsory. So the mid-20th century was a period in which ideas of rights, freedom, and democracy had a great deal of public resonance in Saskatchewan, as well as more widely. Saskatchewan's 1947 Bill of Rights was Canada's first legislation of this sort. The Canadian federal government's 1960 Bill of Rights further entrenched rights and freedoms as frameworks of broad national significance. And the notion of freedom was particularly powerful in Saskatchewan once the Liberal Party came to power, given that provincial Liberals had long sought to appeal to voters by positioning themselves as the promoter and protector of free enterprise, largely as a means of critiquing the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation's democratic socialism. So in this context, and in the face of the Liberals' aggressive approach to irrigation, ideas about freedoms, rights, and democracy came to define the conceptual terrain on which Drylanders objected to irrigation. Critics of government irrigation policy sought to align their perspectives with these virtues and to marshal these virtues to compellingly present their views. We see this sort of rights rhetoric pervading letters to government. We see it in petitions, and we see it in comments that were made by irrigation dissenters to a variety of media outlets. By way of a few examples, we see letters to the editor signed by the Irrigation Investigation Group calling the compulsory dimension, the water tax dimension of this legislation, a violation of the democratic rights of the citizen. We see concerned farmers arguing also in the media that their rights to live in a free and democratic society ultimately oblige the government to alter its approach to irrigation. Now, farmers' efforts to assert their ideas of rights were not limited to rhetorical forms. Farmers sought to physically interrupt survey work, confronting government agents and refusing to allow them to enter onto their farms. And this action was presented by farmers as an effort to assert the right of private property. Now, opponents of irrigation invoke notions of democracy, rights, and freedom, not just to express their own profound outrage, but also to try to strategically position their cause so as to appeal to the public at large. But irrigation in Outlook-Broderick bore directly on only a small percentage of Saskatchewan's farmers or Canada's citizens. All farmers and all citizens, the underlying logic ran, should ultimately be concerned about the cavalier disregard for the ideals of rights, democracy, and freedom that was being exhibited by the Saskatchewan government. Indeed, some leaders with the Irrigation Investigation Group felt that the matter was so serious as to be of global concern. And I've put on the slide before you now a quotation that sort of asserts that case. This passage is from a farmer from the Broderick area by the name of Marner Larson, who's asserting that the government's refusal to allow the people of the Broderick area the right to express their freedom of choice in relation to irrigation ultimately poses a problem as serious as that suffered by any minority group in the world today. So I think what we're seeing here are efforts by farmers to harness the prevailing rights culture so as to push back against the state. I think these efforts were energetic and creative, but these efforts ultimately fell short of matching the power of a Liberal majority government. The Liberals did indeed pass the South Saskatchewan River Irrigation District Act in spring 1966, ultimately choosing to prioritize their view of provincial economic development despite what Dryland farmers understood as violations of the principles of rights, freedom, and democracy. The passage of this legislation in spring 1966 did not by any means spell the end of Drylander resistance, but there were some other factors at play in the following months and years that further complicated these resistance efforts. The first complicating factor was the promise of an impending economic boom related to potash mining in Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan's significant potash stores were attracting substantial global attention in this period, with the potash mining industry seeming on the verge of a really transformative boom. Potash extraction required access to substantial volumes of water. The government had planned to meet this need through the development of what became known as the Saskatoon Southeast Water Supply System. This was a system of channels, reservoirs, and pipelines that depended on the same infrastructure that had been developed to support irrigation. So it was sort of built as an offshoot of the infrastructure that had been built with an eye to developing irrigation in the area. The prospect of economic diversification had always been part of the province's case for the South Saskatchewan Regional Plan, but the matter was made more concrete. The sort of link between the development of water management infrastructure and economic prosperity was made more concrete by the connection between water management infrastructure and this looming promise of potash-driven prosperity. And so this new connection between water management and anticipated economic prosperity ultimately established a context in which state investment in water management infrastructure could be cast as necessary and appropriate, even amid persistent contention around irrigation. And a second complicating factor in this post-1966 period was the establishment of some irrigation in the Outlook-Broderick area. The government had taken steps to acquire land from Dryland farmers who were willing to sell and to attract to the area farmers who were interested in getting involved with irrigation. By fall 1966, with public funds and support available, irrigation development was underway on the farms of at least 6 local operators in the Outlook-Broderick area. And the current image on the slide before you here, the one that isn't potash, is the irrigation system designed for the province to be used in the Outlook-Broderick area. And so the sort of 6 new irrigators that I'm identifying would have been situated within this landscape of canals. So the establishment of irrigation in the Outlook-Broderick area ultimately made this community a more complicated place, one that included people who were profoundly opposed to irrigation, who remained profoundly opposed to irrigation, and also people who were themselves aspiring irrigators. So after a provincial election in 1971, complexity in relation to irrigation became an NDP problem. The matter became even more challenging. The matter of managing complexity around irrigation became even more challenging as it became clear that these incipient irrigators in Outlook-Broderick were having a really difficult time. Irrigation farmers in Outlook-Broderick were struggling to pay costs for essential on-farm infrastructure and land leveling. There was no way around these expenses if you want to move ahead with irrigation, and they were really big outlays. These irrigation farmers who were having a difficult time ultimately formed their own lobby group in 1972, which they called the Outlook Water Users Association. And they used this organization to lobby the provincial government for additional supports in favor of irrigation in the Outlook-Broderick area. So the new NDP government in Saskatchewan responded to all of this in a few ways. One, the government did indeed deploy new supports to prop up new irrigation farmers in Outlook-Broderick. The government also sort of scrambled in a kind of frantic way to try to support the growing of high-value irrigated crops in the Outlook-Broderick area, based in the notion that establishing sugar beets or potatoes or alfalfa cubing or market gardening would ultimately stabilize the economics underlying irrigation. And the NDP also maintained the prospect of imposing the water tax. This tax, despite the fact that the statutory authority for it had been on the books since 1966, had not actually been collected by the Liberal government or by the NDP government in its first years in power. And the NDP maintained the prospect of imposing this water tax in future years. This is notable in part because maintaining the prospect of imposing the water tax amounted to a continuation of prior Liberal policy rather than a return to the earlier CCF approach, which has seen the government give a fair bit to those farmers who objected to irrigation. Part of the story here is a change in how governments and administrators thought about fairness in relation to the irrigated landscape. If the CCF had earlier been concerned about being fair to Outlook-Broderick's Dryland farmers, the NDP now balanced this concern about fairness to Dryland farmers with a concern about fairness to emerging irrigators in the area. And at least some within government felt that under this new calculus of fairness, the imposition of the water tax might be required. And so in January 1976, the NDP government decided that both fairness and fiscal responsibility required the imposition of the water tax in the Outlook-Broderick area. Unsurprisingly, this move prompted a resurgence of opposition from affected farmers who were not interested in irrigating. We see this resurgence of opposition evident in raucous public meetings, in petitions, and in correspondence to government, as well as communications with media. It's very clear in the historical record. Opposed farm operators also displayed their displeasure by defying the order to pay up. By September 1976, the water tax had been paid on only 5 farms out of the 45 on which it had actually been levied. The resurgence of opposition to irrigation led to the formation of a group called the Gardner Dam Drylanders. This was a group, the Gardner Dam Drylanders, that was led by 2 local women, President Loretta Ballack and Secretary Margaret Larson. Both were longtime opponents of compulsory irrigation who farmed in the Outlook-Broderick area. The Gardner Dam Drylanders, according to these leaders, amounted to a new iteration of the earlier irrigation investigation group. Loretta Ballack was interviewed in 1977 about her leadership of this organization, the Gardner Dam Drylanders. And in this interview, Ballack suggested that she and Margaret Larson stepped up to lead, in part because the men who had headed earlier efforts at pushback had become discouraged, perhaps even resigned to the inevitability of compulsory irrigation. And in this context, the women thought it was only right that they should take their turn at the helm. I think the leadership of women like Larson and Ballack reflects the long-established practice of women and men sharing in farm work and illustrates that this pattern extended into advocacy on farm issues. And it's pretty clear in the historical record that neither Larson nor Ballack felt that their gender moderated their responsibilities to take on leadership roles in this regard. Leadership by these women also suggests their confidence that their advocacy efforts would not be disadvantaged because these efforts were headed up by women. This might relate to how anti-water tax advocacy related to the preservation of established homes and communities, so might be understood to refer to women's purported special areas of expertise. It might also relate, of course, to increased society-wide understanding of the importance of women's contributions, in the aftermath of the Royal Commission on the Status of Women and other broad social changes in these years. Now, Ballack and Larson's advocacy efforts were really broad and creative. They replicated some of the techniques that we see earlier from the Irrigation Investigation Group in appealing directly to government, in drafting submissions, in presenting their findings at all sorts of meetings. Ballack and Larson also took on the new step of approaching the recently created provincial ombud in Saskatchewan, only to learn that the irrigation matter didn't fall under the jurisdiction of this body. This ultimately led Margaret Larson, Ballack and Larson, to contact Bob Cooper. Bob Cooper was the host of a Canadian Broadcasting Corporation television program called Ombudsman. Here he is. Ombudsman ran on Sunday evenings between 1974 and 1980, and this is a program that focused on potential malfeasance by government or corporations, particularly insofar as wrongdoing might be seen to compromise citizens or consumers' rights. As Ballack understood it, Cooper was quite keen to address the water tax issue, and he and his film crew visited the Outlook-Broderick area in fall 1977. In mid-October 1977, after the Ombudsman episode was filmed, but before it went to air, the Saskatchewan government announced substantial changes to irrigation policy. These changes involved the creation of new supports that would be put in place to prop up incipient irrigation in Outlook-Broderick and to incentivize further irrigation development in the area. But most importantly, for irrigation dissenters in Outlook-Broderick, these changes also involved a commitment from government that the water tax would no longer be imposed on established dryland farmers. So this amounted to a removal of the compulsory dimension to irrigation in the Outlook-Broderick area. So this was in many ways a success for Ballack and Larson. But in an interview that took place mere days after the Saskatchewan government had announced its change in policy, Ballack was pretty measured and sort of tentative in her evaluation of the new circumstance. She was happy for the reprieve, but she was worried that the outcome might not be the victory that she and her fellow dryland farmers had long desired. And indeed, controversy persisted around irrigation in Saskatchewan, though in the period after the removal of compulsion, we see a shift in contention away from issues around rights toward issues around viability. In the context of increasing concern about the viability of irrigation in the Outlook-Broderick area, a key public voice was that of Eric N. Farden. Eric Farden was a chartered accountant who had long had a practice in the Outlook-Broderick area. And Farden expressed a number of times that on the basis of his work as an accountant serving farmers in the district, including both dryland and irrigation farmers, he felt he had a professional obligation to speak out. And speak out he did, quite frequently and regularly in media, in all sorts of context, public meetings from the late 1970s through to the mid-1980s. One of the key techniques Farden used in speaking about irrigation in the area was to point directly to his own experiences as an accountant. He would regularly explain that of the 30-something farmers he had served in his accounting practice, over 80% of them who were irrigation farmers had experienced complete financial collapse. He underlined repeatedly that the vast majority of his clients who were involved in irrigation just found that their expenses quite regularly outstripped their revenues. And this is just a sample of one of an almost innumerable number of media reports anchored by Farden's critical voice. He's the one featured in the pull quote at the center here. So in Farden's view, irrigation was a community tragedy, and government encouragement of it was indefensible. So whether successful or not, the prospect of irrigation and the policies used to advance it had indeed driven change in the Outlook-Broderick area. Longtime residents had moved on and new people had moved in, and the area's agricultural model had shifted quite substantially. Despite the seeming success of dissenters like Loretta Ballack and Margaret Larson, and the persistence of critical voices like that of accountant Eric Farden, the local community and the agricultural lifestyle that Drylanders had hoped to protect had been substantially changed. And so the ultimate removal of compulsion was insufficient to halt the social and agricultural changes that had already been put in motion. In light of change in the Outlook-Broderick community, and even while the results of irrigation were equivocal at best, the irrigation that had once been a profoundly divisive prospect became subject to local celebration in the Outlook-Broderick area. This is clearly evident in a 1980 community history titled Milestones and Memories. This publication reflects many features common to the large number of local histories that were published in Saskatchewan and across the prairies in the mid-20th century. And Milestones and Memories, which is a community history of the Outlook-Broderick area, offers a profoundly celebratory rendering of irrigation in this area that for many years had been animated by dissent, glorifying so-called irrigation pioneers, and downplaying local opposition to irrigation development. And this on the screen before you now is just a photograph from one of the final pages of Milestones and Memories. We've got a key piece of irrigation infrastructure to end the text, as well as a passage that situates so-called irrigation pioneers in sort of a tradition of irrigation innovation. I think what we're seeing here is that by this period, Outlook-Broderick had been substantially changed. Those who had stayed in Outlook-Broderick or had moved into the area were those who favored irrigation, and they were ultimately those who wrote the community history. So in celebrating irrigation, I think we risk losing access to the contested character of agricultural change in Outlook-Broderick. I think the history of contestation around irrigation tells us things about rural people's confidence in their own knowledge, about their creativity and persistence in advocating for their beliefs, and about the identities and strategies of local advocates for particular agricultural futures. Near the start of the talk, I said a few things about the importance of resistance in the historical record. I think there are particular reasons why focusing on resistance is particularly useful in the context of the rural agricultural prairies of the mid-20th century, the mid to late 20th century. This is a period characterized by farm consolidation and rural depopulation, what rural sociologist Murray Nuttall has called the erosion of a way of life. I think in making sense of this period in prairie history, we might do well to consider stories of resistance and creativity alongside stories of erosion and loss. Thinking carefully about the history of irrigation in Saskatchewan might help us also to better contextualize the contemporary moment. In the 2020s, right now, Saskatchewan is again pursuing irrigation development in areas adjacent to the Outlook-Broderick area, even in the face of skepticism from economists, concern from environmentalists, and opposition from Indigenous peoples. In doing so, the province is presenting irrigation as a solution to local or provincial or even national problems. But this is a celebratory rendering of irrigation that fails to take account of the sort of history we've been talking about today. And so I hope this historic episode makes clear that irrigation on the prairies has typically generated questions and opposition, and for many good reasons. Despite the persistence of efforts to celebrate and promote irrigation, the controversial character of irrigation has been clear from the earliest days of the South Saskatchewan Regional Plan. And I think that this is a history that tells us useful things for the present moment. All right, that's it.
Thank you. I should talk into the mic. But Shannon, we take some questions.
Oh yeah, I'd be glad to.
Larson.
Oh no, I was just thinking Tom.
I was like, your name was invoked so often. I thought you must have a question. Tom, do you have
No.
Okay, my efforts to be like a talk show host are going nowhere. Okay, yeah, okay, great. All right, and then I'll come back to you. Yeah, sure, I've got that first.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. I'm not a Canadianist, so the question I might ask might be obvious to many of you here. But I was thinking about the comparative approach to the history you told us, right? In the 1960s, by mid-1960s, when the federal government is running through with this project, right, over the concerns of those who oppose the irrigation. Is there, I don't know, is there any other similar process going on, for example, Manitoba with other rivers in terms of different provinces having different outcomes or similar outcomes, you know, in these kind of projects by the mid-20th century, mid-1960s?
Yeah, no, this is very much the mega project era. And there's been And there are dams being built in the Maritimes, there are dams being built in British Columbia, there are dams, of course, being built in northern Manitoba, there are dams being built in Quebec, there are dams being built in northern Saskatchewan, there are dams proposed that aren't going ahead in other places. And so there's a really substantial moment of sort of state energy at developing these sorts of projects, and then, of course, of popular efforts to push back with varying levels of success. So this is absolutely a story that should be understood in relation to a particular historical moment of infrastructure building, but also an important historical moment of communities sort of looking for their sources of strength and looking to speak to those to articulate different visions of ways forward. So it's a really important dimension of these projects, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So just thinking of the location of the Gardner Dam and the area you were talking about. So how was the Lake Diefenbaker related to the irrigation project? I mean, where was the irrigation water supposed to come from, I guess?
Sure, so the water would come from Lake Diefenbaker.
Okay.
So it would be diverted out of that large lake into a smaller reservoir called the Broderick Reservoir. And from there, it would be distributed into the canal serving through this sort of distribution infrastructure here.
Okay. And I guess my secondary question would be if part of the goal of the whole project was to irrigate that area, why was the location of the dam situated so far from the actual area proposed to irrigate? Why not move the dam 100 kilometers or so downstream?
Locating dams is a really tough question. Because these are massive, heavy pieces of infrastructure, and there are all sorts of concerns about bank integrity. Like, is this infrastructure actually going to be safe? And there are instances of sort of catastrophic bank collapses that are very much on the minds of the engineers with the Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Administration that are trying to site this project. And so the antecedents, sort of the history of science story to the eventual construction of Gardner Dam is engineers traveling up and down the Saskatchewan River, taking soundings, digging piles to try to determine if these banks can sustain the sort of load both from the infrastructure itself at the Gardner Dam, the Compel River Dam, but also the weight of the water that would be retained behind Lake Diefenbaker. So they sort of put the infrastructure where they could geologically. Much easier to move water than to remediate bank instability, and much less risky. The other question, of course, is that this is multi-purpose infrastructure. So it wasn't being designed just in relation to irrigation. The two primary justifications were irrigation and hydro, but then there were a whole other set of concerns, including like municipal water supply, industrial water supply, recreation, the list goes on, really. And so often with the management of multi-purpose resource infrastructure, it's sort of touted as a wonderful way to sort of conserve resources, to serve a variety of objectives, but you end up compromising on the management of infrastructure. You keep the reservoir at a different set of levels, you make different decisions about locating the infrastructure than you would if it was a single purpose infrastructure. So some of it is, I think the answer to your question relates in part to geology and in part to the South Saskatchewan Regional Plan as a multi-purpose piece of infrastructure.
Thanks for the answer.
You're welcome. Good question.
Thank you, Shannon. This is really great. Something comes to mind for me, or just wondering about this transition from one of engaging with this as resisting to celebration, and the shift that occurs over time. You mentioned the cultural cohesion or the community cohesion in an earlier period of resistance, and then later there's at least a voice of a celebratory voice, which suggests a level of cohesion as well. What are the broad demographic shifts going on during this period? Is it just different farmers coming in, different kinds of farming coming in, different inputs at this different farming time that not just celebrate but perhaps require the irrigation? Is there anything like that going on?
Yeah, certainly. So in the earlier period, I think I mentioned this, but it probably deserves reiterating in response to this question. the Outlook-Broderick area was one that had a distinctive cultural character as a Scandinavian community. This seems to have been quite a valued aspect of the local community. And I think that the desire to perpetuate this valued local community was part of what made people skeptical about various potential drivers of change. So there is that sort of cultural, to use the language I think you use, like the cultural cohesion dimension early on. And I think we see that valued aspect of the local community sort of gradually eroded, largely through state efforts to advance their irrigation agenda in a variety of ways. There was sort of like massive, well, seemed large to me, I don't know, large volumes of money flowing into the area intended to attract irrigators and to support them in the early expensive years of irrigation. And so people, as dryland farmers left, and some of them left in part because they worried about being forced to irrigate. Some of them left just because it was the natural stage in their life course. Another characteristic of the Outlook-Broderick community in the years immediately prior to irrigation is that farmers were older than average. So they were closer to retirement. And so some of them, left maybe for a combination of reasons, maybe just because demographically or in relation to their own age, it made sense to them. But as irrigators arrived in the area, the community started to change. And I suspect that that process of change sort of ultimately eroded the prospect of maintaining the community that was so valued. And so as irrigation took hold more and more, I think some folks decided, well, what we were fighting for originally was already lost. Not everybody felt that way. Certainly, obviously Margaret Larson and Loretta Ballack did not. But I think that was certainly a factor in some of the attrition and perhaps change in leadership that we see in relation to resistance in this period. So lots going on for the local community here.
Hi, Shannon.
Hello?
My uncle lived about, 40 or 50 miles north of that region, but he too was Scandinavian and would have been born around 1905, and I would have guessed that the entire generation of farmers in a circle of 100 miles even was of a similar age. In other words, in 1953, when that dam suddenly became a big deal, he would have been 48 or something. And by the time the Liberals came in 64 and then became aggressive in 66, he would be 60. And that farm is no longer in the family. Now, that transition occurred in the 1980s, I'd say, which is exactly the span you're talking about. Now, what happened in the same period is a huge demographic shift in the prairies from farm to city.
Yeah.
And suddenly it was possible to serve table foods in Saskatoon from vegetables grown on irrigated land that wouldn't have been a plausible alternative 40 or 50 years earlier. My uncle would probably have been part of that Scandinavian resistance, but his son wouldn't have had any interest in such a thing. He was no longer in any way Scandinavian. He was a Saskatchewan Rough Rider, baseball cap wearing, etc. So age and urbanization seem to me to be two big factors. What do you think?
Yeah, certainly age is a big one too. And urbanization, I mean, unquestionably, Saskatchewan was transformed in these years. And I mean, in some ways, I think the transitions underway. The urbanization across Saskatchewan probably made all of this, it really heightened some of the sentiments around this. That this is a period where much of rural Saskatchewan was experiencing loss, what would have been perceived by many as loss. And so I suspect that fighting for dryland farming in the face of irrigation was also fighting for farming and community in the face of depopulation, and that this became a really heavily weighted struggle in this broader moment of change. That there was a lot at stake. And so it was articulated in ways specific to irrigation, but freighted with all other sorts of sort of broader social processes of change. So yes, I suppose.
And Shannon, I came in a little late and you may have covered this, so forgive me if I'm asking something I already covered. I'm curious to know whether there was much Indigenous input into all of this, reaction to it, impact on Indigenous communities. It just seems to be the kind of thing that would have involved them in some way or other, either marginalization or some sort of consultation.
Yeah. If there was any consultation with Indigenous peoples in advance, I haven't found evidence for it. The closest Indigenous community is the Whitecap Dakota, a little bit north, along the Saskatchewan River from where we're talking about today. Members of the Whitecap Dakota Nation worked on Gardner Dam in the process of construction. They were sort of part of the laboring crew in the mix of this enormous project. Members of Whitecap Dakota performed at the opening ceremony for this affair. These are pretty, these are peripheral involvements. This is not a circumstance where decisions about this infrastructure has been made in ways that take the opinions of this community, or as far as I can tell, any other Indigenous communities, seriously into account. Certainly, as this infrastructure became operational, it drove broader changes of various sorts that affected Indigenous communities in a whole range of ways. Perhaps the most clearly evident downstream environmental effects were in the Saskatchewan River Delta and Cumberland House Cree Nation, where changes in water flow and siltation patterns profoundly disrupted the lifeways of this community that had long benefited from established ecosystem patterns in the Delta. And this would lead to a whole effort on the part of Cumberland House Cree Nation to assert the harms that had been done with them and to seek redress, primarily in the 1980s through the 1990s. So I suppose effects were broad-ranging and serious in terms of consultation in advance, engagements, any sort of benefit sharing. If there was anything like that historically, I haven't found evidence for it.
Sure.
I was just wondering, going forward, what is the lifespan of this dam, and are there plans to replace it, or what's the future looking like?
Historians on the future.
Yeah. Oh no, panic. I suppose. I mean, I don't really know. In terms of lifespan, I mean, every infrastructure has a lifespan. This is a massive infrastructure actively being maintained by Saskatchewan at this point. This is infrastructure that's now under the authority of that provincial government. This infrastructure remains an anchor for dreams about the future. The current expansion of irrigation that's underway is being marketed as an effort to realize the full vision of the South Saskatchewan Regional Plan. I mentioned, what we're talking about today is Saskatchewan's effort to try to make good on their commitment in the 1958 governing agreement to irrigate 50,000 acres. But in the underlying studies, it was anticipated that 450,000 acres would be irrigable on the basis of this project. And so the current Saskatchewan government sees itself as sort of working toward that goal. So this is an infrastructure that is very much, still at play, still anchoring these ambitious visions for regional redesign. And it sort of connects to Dr. Naismith's good question earlier about Indigenous peoples and their engagements. Indigenous peoples are now, they're very clearly asserting their objections to these anticipated additional uses of the dam.
And I'm going to ask you another question now because I've forgotten the details and you'll probably know them.
Uh-oh.
But water has to flow from Alberta and Saskatchewan to Manitoba. And there's a legislated agreement, I assume, in the 1930 transfer. Or is it later? But how much of that Alberta and Saskatchewan water reaches Manitoba? Do you know what that proportion is? Do you know when the agreement was made?
Master Agreement on Apportionment, 1969, 50%.
50%.
50%.
And so, how does this affect that?
I can't think, it doesn't seem to have caused a significant disruption. I haven't seen a trace in the record that that there is an interruption to flow directly attributable to the operation of this infrastructure that interferes with that flow pattern. Significant volumes of water do move downstream. You know, the reservoir is full, but water pours over the dam or around the dam. And so there is significant volumes of water that are still being passed downstream to Manitoba. And Manitoba was very active in this period, of course, already with its own, hydro-based streams for the north. At the time that Saskatchewan was looking to arrange this irrigation project, they had to get Alberta on side. Alberta, had to commit in a period before 1969 that it was not going to retain a volume of water that would make this infrastructure insupportable, and it had to get Manitoba on side. And so this is the work of interprovincial negotiation, largely undertaken under the auspices of the Prairie Provinces Water Board, which is sort of the immediate institutional mechanism put in place after the Natural Resources Transfer Agreement when it became clear that water was going to be a big issue and that they needed some institutional mechanism where they could at least talk about it. Seemed to work pretty well for a bit, and then it didn't. And then the Master Agreement on Apportionment was an attempt to sort of sort things out once again.
I think this has partly been addressed by the question that your answer to this question, which is, I'm wondering what the province's position is in all of this. I mean, they've created Lake Diefenbaker, they've got all this water, and now they want to use it. Is there overcapacity within the lake? Is there a sense that they have to prove up on this? Are there studies? Is this purely economically driven? But what's motivating them to reach into this area at cost to provide water to people that are saying they don't need it?
You mean in this period, like historically?
Yeah.
Yeah. Why does Saskatchewan want to do this? Well, this is a period. This was a project that brought a lot of money into the area and employed a lot of people in the construction period. So this was economic stimulus of sorts, and it was economic stimulus supported in part by the federal government. So there is that substantial benefit to the Saskatchewan provincial government. This is also a period where large-scale infrastructure construction is like symbolic of modernity. And so for a province that, as we get deeper into the mid-20th century, understanding itself as falling behind, understanding itself as not as modern as it might want to be. This is a symbolically powerful move. Does that address your question?
Yeah, I think so, yes.
Okay.
Back to me. Okay. Three short questions. When I was talking about the comparative aspect with other areas of Canada, I was thinking also the follow-up was, what about dissent? Did these people in this community try to reach out to other peoples across Canada that were fighting for similar causes in other places? That's my first question. The second is about, in a way, what we have been talking about, the politics of all this in the 1960s, right? Because on the one hand, you have the interprovincial agreements, all that, they have to get everyone on board to do this. What about the politics in Saskatchewan? Were there other parties that were opposed to this? Did these people try to make some sort of alliance to stop this? And the final quick question is about the sources for your project. Ethnography, did you interviews with people from the area? What were your primary sources for this? Thank you.
Sure. So sources, politics. What was the first again?
This
right, connection.
To get in touch with our people.
Yes. I haven't seen evidence in the record of sort of deliberate efforts on the part of dissenters to say, oh, there's another mega project. There are also dissenters. I should reach out to them. I don't know why. I wonder if it isn't because, we see patterns. We see this as a mega project era. But I wonder if the affected parties in this moment understood their experiences as more singular, as more distinctive. And so, were efforts at dissent that involved a lot of coalition building, but these coalitions were local as opposed to broader. That's entirely a supposition. I don't know. I haven't seen that sort of thing in the record. Beyond the sort of efforts that I've talked about of Drylanders trying to cast their objections in terms that they think are likely to elicit a sympathetic response, sort of connections to what they understand to be broadly shared social ideals around freedom or rights, which is sort of an effort at connection, but it's a really broadcast one, as opposed to specific, you're also affected by this, we should work together, which I haven't seen. Politics. Yeah, the politics are complicated around this. As I mentioned, we see changes in provincial government a number of times through all of this. I don't think that this irrigation in the Outlook-Broderick area was like a factor around which elections pivoted, but it certainly was an issue around which political parties positioned themselves and tried to make hay when they were in opposition. You see this particularly powerfully between the Liberals and the CCF when the Liberals are in 1966 looking to advance this legislation that would make irrigation compulsory through the imposition of the water tax and through the failure to include any sort of provision of a vote. This is, after years of the CCF being in power and the Liberals sort of slagging the CCF as communist and authoritarian and these sorts of claims, then we have the CCF in opposition asserting that the Liberals are behaving in exactly these ways, in these authoritarian ways. So again, there's this sort of rhetorical effort to situate specific actions in relation to agriculture, in the form of agriculture, in terms that are likely to produce an emotional response of sorts. One of the interesting challenges for the CCF early on in all of this, challenge for the Saskatchewan Farmers Union as well, is that the Farmers Union had initially been on side. They're like, irrigation, this sounds great. And then it becomes clear that there's a significant cohort of dryland farmers who do not think that irrigation sounds great. And so you see the Farmers Union sort of recalibrate and step back. And the initial period of consultation, the one dramatized in this National Film Board short, was actually facilitated by the Saskatchewan Farmers Union at the request of the CCF government as sort of an intermediary to try to smooth over this conflict. And I think it probably accomplished some of the objectives that the politicians would have had for it. And certainly the result was, I think Drylanders were happy about the direction in which the government shifted. Now, of course, it all, when there was a change in provincial leadership, it was all for naught. But it does sort of, perhaps, suggest some of the political complexity around all of these matters. Thank you.
So I'm just going to pass the last question to Jason, and then maybe we'll just ask you if we can keep you for another 10 minutes.
Totally.
We can have coffee and conversation as it unfolds.
No pressure.
No pressure.
Oh boy. So I'm still gathering thoughts about this, so if this doesn't come out coherently, I'm sorry. This also might extend beyond what we've talked about today, so again, I'm sorry. But I'm thinking about something you said about changing the riverbanks as changing the boundary of Treaty 6. And so the comparable that I've started thinking about in the last like 5 minutes is the city of Chicago extending the shoreline out into Lake Michigan. And so what they've seen there is that the different bands in the area recognize that land is unceded, it's not treaty land. And they've tried to assert claims in that in various ways. It's messy and it's got its whole own history. Obviously this situation is a little bit different. It's not creation of land specifically, but it's moving the boundary. So my question is like, is there resistance to that? Like what's going on there? Is there any like actual implication that that has muddled in any way?
So my reference to that episode, of course, to this altering the boundaries of Treaty 6, drew on the work of author Matthew James Vagel, who's a creative writer and author who's written these sort of really valuable reflective pieces on his positioning as an Indigenous person in these spaces. And so it's building on his view of this change as significant, as something that deserves noting through to the present day. I haven't seen other expressions of concern about this. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but I haven't, if it does exist, it hasn't been in the records, the historical records I've looked at so far. And I haven't seen any contemporary commentary from experts of any sort around this matter. I found Vagel's approach to it really remarkable. This is a book that is really well worth your time. It reflects Vagel's efforts to conduct archival research, what it means to do that as an Indigenous person, while reckoning with sort of the colonial harms that his family has been subject to. And so it's really broadly reflective, not just on Treaty 6 and Lake Diefenbaker, but also on what it means to sit in the reading room of Library Archives Canada as an Indigenous person. So it's a really rich text.
That is a really good place to sort of move on to another stage of this event. So I want to thank Shannon for a really rich and kind of opening talk that gives us lots to chew on. I also want to thank Sarah Deckert, who is the project coordinator and the knowledge mobilization person for the Just Waters project, who is kind of crucial to all the things we do. I think we have a QR code where you can learn more about the project, and including some upcoming events, some of them in person, some online, and some out with the waters, including in the wintertime, and looking forward also to the springtime. So also thank you to Angela Cicerone and to Pauline Tennant from the Center for Human Rights Research, who have done crucial work, to St. John's College, who always look after us very well, and also to Adam and Chris from AV Services for recording the event. You can relive it in some future moment online. So thank you very much. And Shannon can hang around and maybe we can have coffee and snacks and more informal conversation for a little while. Okay, thank you.